Thank you everybody for joining this first iteration of the Swift Hour. This is a series that we are newly launching here at Concordia to address some of the most pressing issues facing the world today. While we are most known for the summits that we hold, world events oftentimes cannot simply wait for a summit. And Concordia is blessed with a remarkable collection of influencers and leaders, people that have been on the front lines of some of the most pressing and important issues and world events that have ever taken place. And this series is meant to give our entire Concordia community an opportunity to hear from those leaders as world events unfold in front of our eyes day after day. And with that, I could not be more excited to talk today with President Vaira Vīķe-Freiberga, who is one of the original Leadership Council members of Concordia, was president of Latvia from 1999 to 2007. During this time, Latvia became a member of NATO under her leadership in 2004. She was president of the Club de Madrid from 2014 to 2020. Having left Latvia as a child refugee at the end of World War II, President Freiberga started schooling in a refugee camp in Germany in 1945, continued it in French Morocco, and then obtained higher education in Canada with a BA and MA at the University of Toronto and a PhD in experimental psychology in 1965 at McGill University in Montreal. President Vīķe-Freiberga emerged as a prominent spokesperson on politics and science whilst professor of psychology and interdisciplinary scholar at the University of Montreal from 1965 to 1998. President Vīķe-Freiberga returned to her native country in 1998 to head the Latvian Institute, an organization devoted to promoting Latvian awareness abroad. A year later, in June 1999, she was elected president of the Republic by the Latvian Parliament in June 1999 and re-elected in 2003. She was named special envoy to the Secretary General of the United Nations Reform and was an official candidate for UN Secretary General in 2006. Since its founding, President Vīķe-Freiberga sits on the Concordia Leadership Council. Madam President, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining me for the first iteration of the Swift Hour.
Thank you for the honor of inviting me.
So, Madam President, I was reading quite a bit about your biography, and I remember meeting you when I was an undergraduate student at Georgetown University studying under Alexander Kwasniewski, who was somebody you served with while he was president of Poland, you as president of Latvia. But I remember your remarkable story, and your family was displaced during the second Soviet occupation. How has this experience shaped your perspective as you watch what is unfolding today in Ukraine?
First of all, it deepens my empathy with the people who are from one day to the next or from 1 hour to the next finding themselves without a home, without a roof over their heads. Some of them fled in a timely manner, seeing that the situation looked hopeless and that these women and children left to go into exile, all of them crying and saying how much they were sorry to have to leave their home, how much they hoped that they would return as quickly as possible. But for so many of them, there's no home to return to. Their homes have been destroyed. Their lives have been completely wiped out. When you look at these scenes of cities reduced to burning rubble, just think every time you see these burned out empty windows, that behind each of these windows there was a family with its life, its family history, its dreams, its hopes, and its network of relatives and friends who were important to their life. My heart bleeds when I see old people who can barely walk carrying a little dog or a little cat in their hands as they cross this footbridge under Irpin, where the bridge has been blown up, or little children who, some of them have their bunny rabbit or teddy, and others have their little kitten with them, the things that are dear to their hearts. And I remember as a 6-year-old leaving our home in Riga and having to leave a new puppy behind, whom all I have left is a picture of him. And I know how painful all this is. And when they say they would so much like to return as soon as possible, I remember how my parents, for years, they still hoped that somehow, certainly the early years after the war, that the international community would insist on the Soviet Union leaving all these occupied territories that they had taken. And since we had been independent countries before, I mean, the Nazis would be defeated by the Allies. My dad would be listening secretly to the BBC, which could have cost him his life if the Germans had caught him at it. And we knew that the Germans would lose the war. That was coming. But then the hope that Latvians had is that the Allies would request their Eastern ally, Soviet Russia, to sort of remove their armies from the countries they had occupied, and we would regain our independence. And it was a bitter pill to swallow for them. They didn't know about Yalta and how basically Roosevelt and Churchill had sold Eastern Europe out, especially the Baltics. They had sold them out to Stalin as thanks for his help for the West winning the war. And this sense of betrayal, it was a sort of double betrayal that they felt. And so I grew up among refugees. I mean, in contact more or less direct with refugees, depending on where I lived. In Morocco, there were hardly any Latvians at all. But when we went to Canada, there was an exile diaspora there. And I became active within those circles, even as I was extremely active in the Canadian society. I became very busy in the Canadian Psychological Association, various other national and later international bodies. And I was even a representative on the Canadian representative on a panel of the scientific research program of NATO. So that for 3 years, I regularly flew to Brussels as a Canadian representative and sat at our table of discussions with the Canadian flag. But at the same time, I was also involved in the Latvian diaspora, and I acquired a certain reputation as somebody who had things to say about what it means to keep an identity, and if you like, to keep faith with your origins, with your roots, even as you are rooted and absolutely integrated into, as we used to call them, our countries of refuge, that had given us our second home. But the idea that we had been forcibly expelled from our country for political reasons, my parents saw no future for themselves in a communist Latvia whatsoever. They knew they would be the first among those to suffer repressions, because my mother had been an outspoken person, and somebody had already warned her, you just wait, when the Russians arrive, we will, we will take care of you. So that what is happening now, I see a new generation of refugees right here in Europe. And there are so many more of them than there were of us, although altogether from the Eastern European countries, the 3 Baltic countries, from Poland, and from the other countries, Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so on, there were millions of refugees in what became West Germany eventually, the 3 occupying zones that were not under the Soviets. And it's very painful to see this happen again and to be so helpless, to be so absolutely helpless to do anything about it.
I think so many people today are shocked to see how quickly that this all escalated. You worked across the table quite a few instances with Vladimir Putin. Was this a surprise to you, this escalation?
not this degree of escalation. The feelings that he had about the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, are extremely well known. And he expressed them very forcefully at our very first meeting that we had quite soon after his election. He did not want any official. He felt that the political climate was not ripe for official exchanges between Latvia and Russia. Why? Because it was already part of his policy at the time to consider that all these countries that had regained their independence or gained their independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union were basically anti-Russian, that they were unfriendly to Russia by de facto, because they did not remain together with Russia as the same country. As he complained, he says, it's terrible. Now we have a border between our two countries and one needs a passport to travel from one to the other. It's a terrible thing. And I said, oh my goodness, if you knew how happy my compatriots are to have a passport that allows them to travel west to Berlin, to Paris, to London, when before, under Soviet rule, so many of them were stuffed into windowless cattle cars and with a half-hour warning taken and dropped out into Siberia for the simple reason of being Latvians. So that as far as we're concerned, the presence of that border is a great relief to us. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, to me, was the happiest day of my life. For him, it was the greatest tragedy. So that obviously there's a worldview. He was viewing the world from he could not accept a change in the world situation whereby the Soviet Union had collapsed, as I had predicted already in 1968 in a speech to the Latvian diaspora on the 50th anniversary of the founding of our republic. I had said, this empire is going to collapse from its own interior weaknesses. It's a colossus on feet of clay that will collapse, except we don't know how many years or decades it is going to take. He could not accept it. His whole philosophy is based on the fact that the Soviet Union was powerful and feared because it was an oppressor. And he thought that was a wonderful state to be. And this is why he joined the KGB, because the KGB is what are called not just security structures, but there is a name for them, which means oppressive structures. So here's a man who loves the idea of power, of oppressive power over others, and who saw from his childhood on, and as he said, he used to love to watch these propaganda films about the victorious Red Army and about the successful spies and so on. His worldview was stuck in Stalinist times, and he's now in 2022, during this second invasion of Ukraine, he's starting to use increasingly Stalinist terms about anybody who is not ready to submit to Moscow's dictate is a Nazi, by definition. The occupation of the Baltic countries, of course, also was because they were nationalists. In other words, anybody who wants their own independence is a nationalist ipso facto. So in his aims, a nationalist becomes a Nazi. Also not having somebody who takes orders from Moscow like he wanted some Ukrainian presidents to do, that makes them a Nazi when they don't take orders from Moscow. And the denazification and the how did he say, the purges, the purging of the traitors in our midst, that as he described anybody who was against the war or against any aspect of his policy, that these were traitors to the fatherland. He said, whom the real patriots should purge from our midst. Well, that sounds extremely dangerous to me, And I wonder what exactly his invitation to his fellow citizens is, because in Stalinist times, it was enough to be denounced by a neighbor, to be put in front of a troika, an arbitrary three-person tribunal, and the result was known in advance. It was a bullet in the back of the neck for treason or lack of party faithfulness and all the terminology that they use for it. And he is reviving that. The idea of purges in his own country, the idea of invading a neighboring country in order to purge it from individuals who are not submissive to Moscow. Frankly, I find he is bringing us back into that horrible time of Stalinism, and in fact of Hitlerism. He's taking some of the aspects, the sort of racist aspects, to the way he is denigrating the Ukrainian nation. He's sort of taking away their past, denying them the right to nationhood, mocking their language as in fact being practically inexistent as a separate language, and he's trying to humiliate and to denigrate the Ukrainian people in a manner that I cannot term in any other terms but racist.
But Madam President, do you think that, do you believe that he is surprised by the sheer level of opposition, the fight that has come from Ukrainians? It feels like he walked into this thinking that this would be a relatively simple and quick operation, and is finding exactly the opposite.
You see, he had the experience of finding a Ukraine that wasn't really prepared for such a thing as an invasion back in 2014. And the way that the Crimea was taken over by the little green men, whom I remember at the Munich Security Conference, when then President Poroshenko made his speech, he brought out a whole pile of Russian passports that had been taken from prisoners of war that the Ukrainians had taken in the conflict in Donbass and Luhansk, and also partly in Crimea. And these were Russian passports, so the little green men were obviously Russian, although President Putin denied the evident reality. But then shamelessly, after Crimea was annexed by Russia, all these people, the leading people who had led the invasion of the Crimea militarily, he pinned decorations on their chests. And then even more curiously, about 6 months later, these generals and leading military men who had been sort of the actual executors of this annexation of Crimea started dying a premature death, all men in their 50s. And I think half a dozen of them somehow departed this life rather unexpectedly in their early 50s. And it was something that the world noted, but nobody could explain what it meant. But that somehow made me uneasy, because it made me think of the sort of things that used to happen in Stalin's time. And again, this echo of the Stalin period and the Stalin ideology was very unsettling.
Do you talk a little bit about the Ukrainian leadership has said multiple times, we've seen their president speak to parliaments and to the US Congress all around the world to talk about and ask for more help and assistance. And one of the points that he's consistently making is that Ukraine is just the start, that there will be more to come if we as a world community allow Russia to do this in Ukraine. Do you believe that? Do you believe that this is going to escalate into the potential invasion by Russia into a NATO country?
Not immediately, no. For one reason, he hasn't really overcome Ukraine yet, thank heavens. So that if he keeps telling his nation that everything is going according to plan, the plan, by the way, is a concept that is a Soviet concept. here's a man who's absolutely living in the past.
Mhm.
Not only he's rewriting history and rewriting the past according to his own version of it, but he's actually reliving and recreating it. It's the Soviet Union that used to have all these plans all the time, and everybody always had to report the plan has been fulfilled or over-fulfilled. There was a special term because it wasn't enough to fulfill your plan, you had to over-fulfill your plan on paper.
Mhm.
In real life, it was a different story. Here he is constantly repeating, everything is going according to plan, when of course anybody who has eyes to see and ears to hear knows that it's going absolutely not according to the plan he had, which was to be in Kiev in 3 days' time and have a victory parade and install a puppet government in the place of the one elected by the Ukrainian people.
So,
He would be ready to take on other countries once he does have his victory parade at some point, or when he has, I don't know how this could be done, but of course it would be helpful if there was some way that he of course has a lot of imagination about spinning stories. That's one thing one has to give him credit for. He can make an elephant out of a fly in the snap of your fingers, you know. So he could make out that he has won a victory, and hopefully there would be some way. People keep talking about the off ramps for him. You see, so something face saving that he could sell to his people, because obviously he has a population that are so zombied by decades of propaganda that he can tell them anything and they will believe it. So that's not a problem. The problem is what resources he still has and how he calibrates the reaction he's got from the West and from the rest of the world. I'm sure he's now, laying his little toy soldiers out in a line and counting how many allies he has and how many have condemned him and how many have put sanctions on Russia and how severe these are and all that. He is a calibrating and calculating man in that sense. But I think that in his long-range plans, already when I first met him, it was quite visible that he was following a plan laid out in Soviet times of having potential frozen conflicts all around the periphery of the Russian Federation, countries that had belonged either to the former Soviet Union or to its satellites. In Latvia and in Estonia, it was the minority, the Russian-speaking minority, that had been imported, deliberately imported in Soviet times, even as so many local ordinary citizens were deported in mass deportations to Siberia. This movement of population that was started by Stalin and that continued for quite a long time by the industrialization of these places. The split of Transnistria off from the rest of Moldova was deliberately done in Soviet times to make sure if ever the Soviet Union should start losing its power and stability, there would be planted a frozen conflict already where you only had to sort of blow on the coals to get the fire going. Similarly, in 2008, the so-called independent republics that Russia helped to create, although nobody, it's curious that he did not annex these. They're sort of having a sort of no man's land, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But already in 2008, he started this technique of actually tanks rolling across the border, and tanks did come within 49 kilometers of Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. So we were warned in 2008, and yet in 2008, that was the year when both Georgia and Ukraine had been refused the membership action plan for NATO that they had been begging for. Their populations were not even ready to join NATO, frankly, at that time. But their leaders were wishing to prepare their defense forces for a greater compatibility with NATO and take to reinforce their security positions and so on. In 2014, when the attack came on Crimea by these men without insignia, who later had medals pinned on their chests for heroism in a service of the fatherland, even as before, they didn't even have they weren't recognized as being Russian soldiers. Well, at that time, Ukraine was not ready enough to hold back this attack at the time. And they received a lot of help since that time, and the results are now visible.
But when you say a population, for instance, the example you were talking about with Georgia, when you say a population is not ready for NATO membership, what does that mean?
It means that if you do a survey of how many people wish to belong to NATO, I think that in 2008, you'd have to Google the figures, to get the exact figures. But I think that there was not a majority of Ukrainians, for instance, who in 2008 would have been say, yes, we absolutely want to be into NATO. Now, as the years went by, and obviously since 2014, that number has jumped significantly. For heaven's sakes, it's even jumped significantly in Finland, which for over for half a century, no more than that, for 75 years, has kept its position of neutrality and not wishing to join any defensive alliance. And now the population of Finland, I think it's 2/3 of the Finns would be ready to join NATO tomorrow. But similar changes happened in Ukraine, and I don't know the figures about Georgia, but I suspect that even there, the experience they had in 2008 would push people to wish that they had an alliance that could protect them, because obviously a country the size of Georgia alone, just like a country like Latvia, cannot count on being able to withstand an invasion by a country like Russia. We see how difficult it is for a country even of 44 million like Ukraine, and with substantial armaments at its command, and they're even manufacturers of armaments after all. It is extremely difficult because they're outnumbered about 10-1.
But so let's shift gears to talk about NATO, this incredibly important alliance. But that photograph really stood out to me of the leaders coming together. It was a representative. It was something we haven't seen in the last, say, 10 years, that kind of unity come together in that way. Is NATO doing everything that it should be doing in this instance, or are we as a community doing enough?
NATO is being very bureaucratic in its approach and very literal in interpreting its mandate and the treaties. And according to those, it is acting absolutely perfectly in accordance with the way the treaties were formulated. Unfortunately, the reality on the ground is such that something, if you like, thinking outside of the box would be really needed at this time to intervene and to make truly a visible difference in Ukraine. Right now, I think we are prolonging the period of resistance that Ukraine is able to offer to Russia while they are regrouping. And I think that their readiness to engage, for instance, supposedly in talks and diplomatic discussions, seeing the kind of hard rhetoric that President Putin has been using, and seeing the very harsh way in which he has set his goals, I fear that this readiness to talk, which of course everybody applauds because one hopes to put a stop to the slaughter that's happening. It's a war against civilians that's going on in Ukraine at the moment. One would wish every day would save lives if it can be stopped. I fear that there's goodwill is definitely lacking on the Russian side, and that they may be using this if you like, excuse simply while they're regrouping, and that their intentions haven't changed. But of course, they may change. Things can happen. We Latvians and others, we waited 50 years and we did get our country back. It does happen. The winds of fate, can blow from a different direction, and things can happen. So that already it's a miracle what the Ukrainians have achieved in the last month. And the resistance they've been able to put up has been fantastic. Absolutely not according to Russia's plan. Sadly, the human cost has been enormous. It is truly an enormous cost, not just in lost lives, but in lives that have been destroyed for those who are driven into exile, for the children whose fathers will fall on the front and who will have to grow up as orphans and all that sort of thing. The human cost continues to mount up, and it is quite enormous.
In closing, Madam President, what do you see as a future for Russia post Vladimir Putin?
One sees signs of Russia, of course, looking around in the world for leaders and countries with similarly inclined authoritarian leaderships. A French program I was watching yesterday emphasized how President Putin received President Bolsonaro of Brazil, not known for being, what you and I would call an enlightened leader, frankly, in many eyes, but the leader, nevertheless, of a very, very large country. And the commentators were saying, see how he's receiving Bolsonaro sitting on either side of a table that's just 50 centimeters wide, and look at how he's sitting with President Macron, who's currently France being the leading country in the European Union. He has a 6 meters separating him from President Macron, and barely 50 centimeters, half a meter, separating him from Bolsonaro, wishing to emphasize thereby that here's an affinity of style of leadership and authoritarianism. And of course, sadly, there's no lack of other countries with authoritarian leaders who might wish to keep good relations with Russia. After all, there are plenty of countries in Europe who over the past decades have done their best. They have bent over backwards to try and be friendly, to have business relations. And we are, in fact, in terms of the gas and oil supplies coming from Russia to Europe, of course, we are deeply entwined with the economy of Russia. They are not alone. The commentators were saying, let's not believe that we have managed to isolate Putin and he's become a pariah and nobody will talk to him. Some countries, he will be a pariah. Democratic countries will certainly consider him a pariah. He will find, if you like, soul brothers or sympathizers in the world. And they will, if he manages to sort of draw them all together, it's a rather unpleasant thought, if not a scary thought, about how the world might be against splitting up. We at the Club de Madrid, for the years that I've been with it, we have always emphasized the need for multilateralism, for a rules-governed world, not a unipolar world, but a bipolar world where you have, if you like, democratic countries on one side and autocratic countries on the other is not a pleasant prospect to look forward to. It just may happen.
As we close out this first edition of Swift Hour, please, Madam President, with all of your collective experiences, give us something that you feel we should all be very optimistic about.
The ability of individuals to change history by their determination and their conviction, and most of all, the values that they believe in. I think that if we remain firm in our belief in the importance of a rules-governed world, of the importance of every human life, of our refusal to engage in discrimination and hatred towards certain aspects of our society, our determination to do away with the huge inequalities that do exist even in the best of our societies. If we remain determined and firm in our convictions and continue to work for them, I think so much has been already achieved in so many countries in the world. I think we should be working to maintain it, to solidify it, to safeguard it, and to keep on improving. And that's I think, encouraging enough, because that means we are not going to be bored, you see. We will have things to do.
Well, that is certainly something to be very optimistic about, and so many instances of examples where human ingenuity, perseverance, creativity is coming out over and over and over again in stories we're covering day after day. So, Madam President, thank you so very much for your time, and we are grateful for it.
And all the best to Concordia. I remember the young boy with the idea, and congratulations on what Concordia has become.
Thank you.